Okay, prepare because I'm going to speedrun this initial part. Welt Sustain works by slowing, breaking, and delaying your enemy's weaknesses long enough for your overbuffed ally to defeat the enemy before they get to do anything. The reason you would run him over a regular sustain is because he provides amazing offensive potential no sustain comes close to doing. He applies vulnerability, which works for all damage types, DOT, crit, break, whatever you so will. Can run weapons like Pearls or Rain, and can be run on a DPS build to have your sustain do 60,000 damage per skill on a mediocre build. Imagine what happens if your build is better than mine or you have his E1. Now, he really shines when supporting debuff reliant DPS, with emphasis on this. If you're already unaware, Acheron heavily relies on both debuffs and nihility characters in general. If you care to make her ludicrously powerful, as in as powerful as having her E2, then you will watch and understand what I mean. I won't be talking about leaks in depth, but I will be making references to Acheron a lot here, so the people who are aware of leaks can get a grasp of the power I'm not only offering but teaching. For people who just want a guide, head to the timestamp. First of all, the reason it works and why it's so much better than other sustains is because Welt does everything. He doesn't do a particular role amazingly, but he does a part of everything. Damage on his own, as I've said before, debuffing towards the enemy, and finally, the part I want to focus on, delaying the enemy using his slows and imprisons to let you last long enough to push you to victory. Do not get this twisted. Welt doesn't actually sustain you. What he does is he puts you on a timer and cripples the enemy in the process. You have until however long Welt can allow to destroy your enemies with his debuffs and the buffs you are running on your team. This is a noticeable damage increase. You will see from my videos, but you will go from doing 100,000 damage to 150,000 damage, or 290,000 damage to 400,000 damage, when swapping from a regular sustain like Fujiwan to Welt. The damage is not only noticeable, but potent and powerful. It truly is such a substantial level of damage increase, and this increase is even more powerful on debuff-reliant characters like Ratio and Acheron, where teammate slots need to be filled up with nihility debuffers or debuffers in general. You can swap out your sustain character for Welt, who would provide an offensive increase anyway, and open up your team to running more overpowered supports that you couldn't run otherwise, like Ruan Mei and Bronya. For other teams not including Ratio and Acheron Hypercarry, Welt Sustain can average a 30 to 40% damage increase over running a typical sustain, but for Ratio and Acheron in particular, the ability to run an incredible powerful harmony unit on top of fulfilling their niche can double their damage. For Acheron in particular, it would be almost like running her E2 for free. Now, I will not pretend that there aren't caveats or that this comp is easy, because it isn't, but I will not allow you to call this team cope, not when it's this strong and powerful. If you want to have your Acheron be as strong as E2 for free, tune in for the guide part. Trust me, you will need it. Now then, on to making this comp work, because it isn't as self-explanatory as using Fujiwan's skill every 3 turns. There are 3 main things you need to know: the power of hard CC, turn skipping, and enemy turn manipulation. Hard CC, which is imprisonment, entanglement, and freeze, prevent the enemy from doing anything, and I mean anything. You see Kafka trying to dominate or do a follow-up? No. Does Sid want to try steal some characters? We are not having another Firefly incident. Do the Silvermane guards want to counter? I thought I told you, though. Unless an enemy gets these statuses cleansed, they cannot and will not do anything. This means any mechanic, any gimmick, anything that requires the enemy to take action gets told to take a hike and will not happen until it is cleansed. This is how you cheese annoying and gimmick bosses and have a massive advantage over other sustains who cannot do this, not having to deal with stuff that would be run-ending for other supports, like Sid's soul stealing or Kafka's domination. Turn skipping is perfectly timed CC or crowd control. Now that you know hard crowd control prevents anything until cleansed, what happens if you use it when it's the enemy's turn? Well, their turn will end. The only way, and I truly mean the only way, the enemy can get around this is if the hard crowd control does not land. If it does, no matter what was happening, once the crowd control lands, the enemy's turn ends. And not only does it end, it gets treated as if they took a full action. What this means is that they get sent all the way down the action value ladder. What Welt does is particularly nasty, because not only does he turn skip, he also delays the enemy's action on top of that and slows them down. What would have taken them 70 AV or half a cycle would now have them act in the very next cycle entirely, or if the enemy becomes weakness broken, the next 2 cycles away they are sent. And if you somehow manage to imaginary weakness break them and imprison stack on top of that, you will not be seeing the enemy for maybe 3 to 4 cycles. Turn skipping can and also currently can be used by March and Misha, both of which have freeze in their ultimates, and any other future character that can imprison, freeze, or entangle with an ult or follow-up. Also, please do recognize that if you weakness break an enemy in a similar fashion during the action, it will be treated in the same way and it will end the enemy's turn, so do please plan accordingly. Finally, the value of slows, and you need to pay attention to this. Even if you know about the value of hard crowd control and turn skipping, you need to understand that the enemy you need to understand the enemy to truly be able to be nigh untouchable in Welt Sustain. If an enemy is about to act, if you use Welt's ultimate just because you got it, you will barely notice any change in that action value. That's because speed is a marathon, not a race. If you slow or push back the enemy right at the end, sure, it would push them back, but it will not help your characters catch up or surpass them. To those who have Ruan Mei, you might understand this from her weakness recovery delay, which says it pushes the enemy's action backwards, but then they still end up acting next anyway. If you do, however, CC them when they are all the way at the end, when their action has barely begun, when they're just starting, not only do they have a lot further to run, but due to Welt's slows and imprisons, he will make the marathon much worse and delay their action even further because they have so much longer to run and they will be taking more time while doing it. You need to time your ults and maximize them. Turn skipping is recommended exactly for this reason. Ulting after their turn will also be fine, as it is the same thing. They'll be pushed back by the same amount, but the closer they get, the less value your action delay and slows will be. Applying slows with a skill and ulting at the right time will grant you cycles of freedom and power, enough time to complete the mission and destroy the enemy, but without enough slows, the very fast enemies of MOC 12 will catch up. The average speed of an elite enemy here is 150, going up to 190 sometimes. With Welt's slows and delays, you can make them go from acting twice or maybe 3 times a cycle to only acting once during the very next cycle. Now, what you need to know, and that's the intricate details and tips and tricks. First of all, the comp isn't flawless. If it was, you would see more of it. It works exceptionally well against imaginary enemies because Welt is imaginary, but it will struggle against non-imaginary enemies because Welt cannot weakness break them. Unless your DPS is that strong that with all of these buffs they are able to slaughter the enemy regardless, you will need to be able to weakness break your enemy to be able to help delay and further increase your damage to eventually beat them. This means having your DPS be on element or being able to reduce the enemy's toughness. If your DPS is able to do this with the freedom Welt provides, along with the time and extra actions or toughness break efficiency provided by allies like Sparkle, Tingyun, Bronye, Ruanmei, and Aster, you can work through it. I would show it if I could, but I only have Dani Bibatulune and Ratio, and the gameplay I have of other characters like Blade, Jinglui, and Seal Clearing is of the old MOC, unless you are willing to watch that. If you cannot either kill the enemy with your immense DPS or weakness break them, the comp will not work. Second tip. There is one hard counter to this, which is enemy's ability to resist the crowd control from his ult. On most enemies that do not have crowd control resistance or imprison resistance, you will need an average of 40 to 60% effective rate to have a very, very solid chance of landing the imprison every time. You can have more if you want, but that's enough for me, and a solid amount you can gain from weapons and substats. Against enemies with imprison or crowd control resist, however, to have to guarantee the chance of your imprison landing, you will need a little bit over 200% effective rate, which clearly is not easily achievable. Now, for a solid chance, you can try 100% effective rate, and it would land more often than it doesn't, but it is not guaranteed and might end up making you constantly restart the half. Currently, there's only 3 enemies who have this problem, with one more coming more in 2.1. One is Ebony Deer, who has this problem but doesn't really suffer, or well, you will not suffer due to how the boss fight works and its small HP pool. Next is Gepard, who while is having CC resist is weak to imaginary and has a very small toughness, as well as being incredibly slow. Once he is weakness broken, he will not be a problem again. The other we currently have is Sam, who is a problem, but is weak to imaginary, so Welt can contribute towards either toughness breaking or simply playing against his mechanic using skill points. The final enemy is a boss that compounds all the other major weaknesses, as having no imaginary weakness and card control resistance, meaning if there was an enemy that would be troublesome to face with Welt Sustain, it would be that boss coming in 2.1. The final weakness that this has is against multi-phase bosses. When a boss resets their HP, they cleanse all debuffs, meaning the slow and imprisonment. The only way to deal with this is to have a second ult ready, which is more often easier said than done. This requires understanding and planning, which might require retries or build changes. It's fine if this comp doesn't work against these enemies or it just doesn't work for you, as I've said before, it was never supposed to be easy. I only told you of the promises of power it holds. Now here are a few other things worth mentioning. If your character has if the enemy has imaginary weakness, know delaying the enemy action scales off break effect and by a set amount once they are weakness broken. Welt's ultimate has a set amount of action delay, which can be increased by upgrading his ultimate. But if you weakness break an enemy with imaginary weakness, for every 10% break effect you have on your imaginary character, this would further delay the action by 3%. At 100% break effect, you double the initial action delay on the enemy and get sent back by at least a cycle and a half, if not more. It is viable to run this, but if you need more Welt ultimates for different scenarios like multiple boss bars, as I've said before, you can always go back to running an energy recharge or an attack rope if your Welt is a DPS. Another tip is that Welt with Penacony on Von Whack gets his ult in 1 skill and 1 basic at the start of the run, and 3 skills if you just used his ult or 5 basics. If you run tutorial on top of that, it would be 2 basics against defense shredded enemies at the start, 1 skill and 2 basics, and after just using your ultimate, and just barely 4 basics to get your ult back after cast. This means if you was to get hit by any kind, you would be reduced from 4 basics to 3 basics when using energy recharge rope, Von Whack or Penacony, and tutorial being able to trigger it. Finally, if you had his E2 on top of that, 2 basics to get his ult from the start, 2 skills just by itself after using his ultimate, and 3 basics just by itself after using his ultimate to get his ult back. This means if you have his E2 and being able to proc tutorial and are running Penacony or Von Whack, he will almost never not have his ult up. I will have an image showing all of this because that might be a lot to follow, so don't worry. Now, next tip is knowing your enemy. A lot, and I mean a lot of enemies do not suddenly just nuke you or surprise you. They take set actions and only ever really change their targets. This means it's very easy to time your turn skipping to just before the enemy is about to do something really nasty to buy you extra time. This can be worth holding your Welt ult even if you had it since their previous action, because the real action you are wary of is the current one. Furthermore, enemies have set action patterns and they were not designed to be turn skipped. Sam does a blast attack, then combusts, then another blast attack, then does a single target punch, then his AoE ultimate. If you were to skip his second blast attack, the next time he takes action, he will spend both actions making up for his previous one before. This means he will blast attack, then use a single target attack, and will not use his ultimate. This can buy you extra cycles against many different bosses. But this also means you have a very real timer if you skip the enemy's ultimate, as you only have until the weakness breaking them to reset the action order, or defeating them that's stopping them from ulting and destroying you. Play smart and play well. There's a lot of strategy that goes into this, and it's why I find it so fun. Finally, run whatever build that works for you. In my videos, I normally run pure damage supporter, which means 60% effect hit rate, pearls, and high speed with the energy recharge rope. With his vulnerability he gives with his ultimate, the defense shred from the weapon, and the enemies taking more damage from being weakness broken, and having that weakness broken duration extended, Again, for non-debuff reliant teams, expect a 30 to 40% damage increase. For debuff related ones, the damage increase is at least the same. Then add on top of that however much damage your new Harmony character will be providing. I have also run a pure DPS version, and while I couldn't be satisfied with it due to my bad relics and requiring different weapons, I still managed 60k skills and had zero issue with Sid at all. If I had better relics and had his E1, I would have a sustained character that does 100,000 damage a turn. Please remember that. Now then, I will continue making Welt Sustain videos because it's incredibly fun to do and the power boost feels very, very real. I will be abusing Acheron with him. If I do not manage to get her E2 S1 with my saved up pulls, trust me, it would look like I did get her E2 S1 with how powerful Welt Sustain is for her. And if I do manage to get her E2, be prepared to see her run Libronia and Drone at the same time, doing ludicrous amounts of damage. Whatever damage spreadsheet or estimations that someone has done for her, if it does not include Welt Sustain in there, it's automatically losing out on its biggest and strongest near free-to-play comp. All you need is a Harmony character of your choice, Pella and Welt, who you can obtain through losing the 50-50, or using your standard selector on him as I have. Remember to check back to this video after her release and realize the potential. Also, make sure to check me out when she does release, as I might do a follow-up video after her release, specifically talking about her team comps. And you will see this Welt Sustain ones as number 1. Finally, please do subscribe. It would change my life. Thank you for watching, and remember, you will survive or be destroyed. There is no other choice.